Alright, so here's how you name binary compounds. Binary compounds are made up out of two different elements. That is where binary comes from. Okay, so a couple things that you should know before naming it. The first type of compound we are going to name are called ionic compounds. Okay, if you look at the periodic table, the guys that are red in here, these are metals. Okay, what metals tend to do is they tend to gain a positive charge when they react. Okay, these guys are nonmetals. Okay, when they end up in a compound with metals, they tend to gain a negative charge. Now, I think we may have talked about in class how the arrangement, and by the way, these guys are called semimetals or metalloids, kind of have some properties of both. We'll talk about those a little bit more later. Okay, now, the columns are called groups or families. Now, something that you may have remembered from class is that this, oops, it's not letting me do it, but this first column, those metals tend to gain a charge of +1. These guys tend to gain a charge of +2. Then we're going to skip all the way over here. These guys tend to gain a charge of +3. These guys tend to gain a charge of, well, -4 and +4. But then it takes a turn. These guys, -3. These guys, -2. These guys, -1. These guys don't react in this column because they are the noble gases. We'll talk a little bit later about them, why they don't react. But this did come up with a song. We said it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1. In terms of the charge that those groups tend to gain when in an ionic compound. Okay, so now let's see about naming them. Let's get over there. All right, so an ionic compound, these are also called salts. Okay, so salt, sodium chloride, is an example of a salt, but all ionic compounds in chemistry speak are called salts. Okay, and an ionic compound is composed of a positively charged chunk, or 2, or 3, or 4, and a negatively charged chunk. Okay, these are called ions, right? So a positively charged ion is called a cation. Negatively charged ions are called anions. Okay, so you're going to kind of recognize these because what tend to form positive charge when they react? Metals, usually. And negatively charged ions? Nonmetals. Okay, so you're going to identify an ionic compound by being metals and nonmetals. Okay, now, I think that you should just take a second and say, like, hey, I know one of these compounds, right? What is that? You would say self. That is sodium chloride. It is delicious on papas fritas. All right, so sodium chloride. Now, go back from the rule. How the heck did you name that? Well, I'm going to go inside your brain for a second, and I'm going to say you said the metal, and then you said sort of, this is chlorine, but what did you say? You kind of said the base and then added "ide." That's how you name ionic compounds, okay? Binary ionic compounds, that is. Okay, so for example here, this would be potassium fluoride, right? This one, is it an ionic compound? Yeah, look at the periodic table. We got a metal and a non-metal together, so it's an ionic compound. This is calcium fluoride. And you might be saying, like, hey, but what about the 2? Yeah, don't worry about it. Don't make it harder than you need it to for the naming of this. This, sodium sulfide. This, lithium iodide. This, magnesium oxide. Okay, now, that is not a metal. Hydrogen is its own weird thing. We'll talk about it later. But that is how you name an ionic compound from the formula. Now let's talk about getting the formula from the name of an ionic compound. Well, essentially, here's what you do. Okay, here's potassium. Write the symbol of it. Here's iodine. Write the symbol of it. But here's what you need to do. All ionic compounds are neutral. All right, and why don't you click on part 2?